Hey there everyone. Today we're going to continue our reading of parts of Division 1 of Heidegger's Being and Time. This fifth lecture is going to focus on the remaining part of Chapter 3 that we haven't discussed yet. This is a very intense chapter, and I just want to remind you that we currently have a reading schedule and reading group occurring with Being in Time. If you would like to join us for a weekly Zoom, you can see the link in the description to the video where I lay out the reading schedule and how all of this will work. But also, if you're seeing this after the reading group is over, feel free to follow along with the schedule, see what it does for you. Should be pretty manageable. You're looking at an average of about 20-ish pages per week, which is going to be perfect for this very dense work. And in this section, we are going to be looking primarily at his Cartesian critiques of Descartes' ontology, as well as some thoughts on spatiality of being in the world and Dasein. Now, Heidegger begins by sort of giving an overview of Cartesian ontology and a little bit of the way that it has been treated in like scholastic ontology and medieval philosophy. So he begins by talking about this idea of res extensia versus res cogitans. So the res cogitans is the thinking thing, which Descartes, this is his word for the human mind, basically. That thing which is defined by its ability to think. And it is different from everything else ontologically, insofar as everything else is res extensia. It is an extended thing. It is defined by its extension spatially, rather than its ability to think. And Descartes mentions, for example, you have things like hardness or weight or softness or color. All of these things are essentially modes of extensia. And there comes to be this idea of substantiality, of this substance which makes something what it is ontologically. So for res extensia, there is some kind of substance which determines them qua res extensia, and then same thing for res cogitans. There is something which defines the thinking thing in terms of its substance that makes it what it is. It is the aspect of a being which is self-sustaining. No matter what happens to it, this is what is left over that is its essence, so to speak. So for example, with what I talked about, the difference in changing of colors or weights of something, like this book, for example, I can cut off half of this book, and it is still res extensia, because it is extended within space. That is a self-sustaining quality of it that is unaffected by the changes in weight or color or size, for example. And this constitutes an ontological horizon for being of that being's being. So it is that horizon by which we understand that particular being's type of being. And he mentions how this is developed for Descartes, for example, by differentiating between the creator, which is fully self-sufficient, self-sustaining in every regard, and basically shows how Descartes does the ontotheological blunder, treating being as a being, which is just the progenitor or originator of other beings. He's not necessarily a genus. In fact, it's even worse than genus, because it's completely cut off, transcendent above all other beings, and just creates those beings after itself. And then, of course, the problem is when we start to predicate the creator with God is ... or humans are ... or the book is ... It seems like we're using is to talk about two categorically different things, right? if creator and created constitute two ontologically distinct realms of being, is cannot be applied univocally. And Heidegger's big project here is to give a univocal definition for being. We can have all sorts of different beings being in very different ways, but being, sein, is common to all of them insofar as it, as he said on page 5, determines beings as beings, right? And again, the word there is bestimmt, to mark, to designate, right? So it sort of reveals them in their being. And he mentions how really what we've done is we've given recourse to ontotheology, thereby splitting ontology into res cogitans and res extensia, and then also between the creator, which is this self-sufficient thing, and then everything else which depends upon the a priori condition, which is the creator. And then we've just said that, well, being applies the way, the same way it would for one to the other, even though they're categorically different. Heidegger writes, this evasion means that Descartes leaves the meaning of being contained in the idea of substantiality, and the character of the universality of this meaning unexplained. Medieval ontology left the question of what being itself means just as unquestioned as did ancient ontology. Thus it is not surprising if a question such as that of the kinds of significations of being gets nowhere, as long as it is to be discussed on the foundation of an unclarified meaning of being, which the signification expresses. The meaning was unclarified because it was held to be self-evident. And he gives a quote from Descartes. Yet substance cannot be first discovered merely from the fact that it is a thing that exists, for that fact alone is not observed by us. So, right, we don't see, just in the same way Hume is saying that we don't see this thing called cause, we just see event A followed by event B, and we imply a cause to make sense of it. In the same way with this substantiality, with this essence that makes that thing what it is in terms of its difference between res cogitans and res extensia, we don't actually see that substantiality per se. And this is basically just saying, well, we don't ontically perceive substantiality, so let's just leave it as a vague term and just sort of plug up this question of being by not actually really addressing it at all. In fact, that's what Heidegger has tried to show this whole time, is that Descartes didn't really have the problem in view. And he actually is kind of charitable to Descartes here, insofar as he explicitly says, well, are we putting too much on him? Is it the case that he couldn't have even really thought of this problematic? And he's like, well, yeah, he kind of couldn't. That's what we're here to do. Because he says, Descartes does not allow the kind of being of inner-worldly beings to present itself, but rather prescribes to the world, so to speak, its true being on the basis of an idea of being equals constant presence, the source of which has not been revealed and the justification of which has not been demonstrated. He furthermore states, his ontology, that being Descartes', is determined by a basic ontological orientation toward being as constant objective presence. So, right, this is something that Descartes is trying to figure out, is he's grounding his ontology in this notion of substantiality, of there being some substance which res cogitans are made of, and some substance which res extensia are made of, so to speak. And this substance is their being in the fullest sense. But of course, aside from the fact that Descartes hasn't even really addressed the question of being at all, he's sort of put it to the side, he's gone one step further, and he's just created this fundamental predisposition to see the world as a series of objectively present states. This is a sort of product of an Enlightenment sort of orientation towards things. And of course, Descartes is part of this burgeoning orientation towards thought, but it is very scientific, right? Descartes is one of these first people where we're really starting to see something like in his discourse on method, we are starting to see the scientific method emerge. And there's this need for a objectivity in viewing the world, right? It is recognized for Descartes that my senses can deceive me and that this is a real problem because for Descartes, this brings into epistemology a question of subjectivity, of the fact that we don't just experience the world as it is in itself, but for Descartes, we see it primarily as essentially cut off from itself. We see it as it is for us, and we have the problem of what Heidegger recognizes as primarily seeing the world, that is, these inner-worldly beings. This is things which are located within a world. Inner-worldly beings does not just mean things which are in the mind, like some sort of pejorative sense. It's not something internal. Inner-worldly just means located within a world. This is a term that in our reading group we've been trying to psych out and figure out exactly what it means, and I think it's fairly conclusive. You can see it at the top of page 95 if you're just curious for a reference. But there is this fundamental presupposition in Descartes' ontology, because he wants to get rid of that subjectivity and wants to try to understand ontology and epistemology from a neutral perspective that's not going to insert his biases. He inadvertently adds the bias that we can effectively separate Dasein from world. And for Descartes, it's not even Dasein that he's talking about. He's talking about res cogitans, which a priori is separated from its world. We start from that separated perspective, the likes of which we see at the beginning of Descartes' first meditation, where he says, you know what, I've decided that I've got all these problems and I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to lock myself in my room as my a priori condition, and then I'm going to start thinking about these problems of epistemology. So in other words, Descartes just assumes that being is self-evidently able to be intuited, and from that gives us a series of presuppositions which mar the history of epistemology and ontology. Heidegger continues here on page 95, hardness is understood as resistance, but neither hardness nor resistance is understood in a phenomenal sense for Descartes, as something experienced in itself and determinable in such experience. For Descartes, resistance amounts to no more than not yielding place, that is, not undergoing any change of location. A thing's resistance means that it stays in a definite place relative to another thing changing its place, or else that it changes its own location with the velocity that permits the thing to catch up with it. But when the experience of hardness is interpreted in this way, the kind of being that belongs to sensory perception is obliterated, and with it, the possibility of grasping the being of those beings encountered in such a perception. Descartes translates the kind of being of the perception of something into the only kind of being that he knows. The perception of something becomes a definite objective presence, this is again Vorhandenheit, of two objectively present res extensia next to each other. So what we have here is a view of ontology which stops at the ontic, effectively bars us from talking about the ontological via the quote that I mentioned earlier, where he says, well, we just don't, we don't experience it. And it's like, well, Heidegger's trying to show that we do experience it obliquely, and we can understand it through this phenomenological hermeneutic analysis. But Descartes' ontology doesn't yield a world which could be lived in by Dasein. It is just one that is occupied by things which are Vorhandenheit, objectively present, plus the separated res cogitans. So once again, we effectively have this a priori framework of separation between res cogitans and res extensia, which is interfering with our ability to understand resistance, for example, as anything other than spatial. He continues, hardness and resistance do not show themselves at all unless there is a being which has the kind of being of Dasein, or at least of a living being. And living here is the important term. The being of the world, which is to say, die Weltlichkeit der Welt, the worldliness of the world, is constituted by a function of showing or revealing itself, which is not possible in Descartes' ontology. The world doesn't have the ability to open up and designate itself, right, bestimmt, to itself, reveal its own being like a Lichtung, like a clearing, as Heidegger says. In Descartes' ontology, all we have is things which are objectively present next to each other, but no way for them to form confluence with one another. No way for it to become a coherent, livable network, which is to say a world, right? And res extensia are defined not by some particular aspect, right, but their general quality of being spatially extended. But this is all ontic, once again. So we're not really actually talking about ontology, per se, so much as we are giving a very philosophical-esque physics. This is a sort of natural science, as Heidegger sees it. Specifically, he mentions, when we get to this section on page 96, he says, but with these criticisms, have we not foisted upon Descartes a task altogether beyond his horizon, and then demonstrated that he failed to solve it? How could Descartes identify a definite inner worldly being and its being with the world if he does not know the phenomenon of world at all, and thus something akin to inner worldliness? Right, so for Descartes, things are not situated within a world. They do not belong to a world. We are not oriented towards our world in the mode of circumspect, heedful dealings. No, we are detached from the world, which presents itself as just a list or assortment of entities. And because of that, it essentially removes the interconnecting logic by which those entities come to create a world which lives, and through which and in which we can live. Because is just is for Descartes. He's not even capable of understanding the relationship of is to world, and thereby the relationship of Dasein to world, right? Because Dasein has this unique access to is, to being, to the question of being. That's why he's chosen it as his entity for our preparatory analysis. He says that Descartes forced the ontology of the world into the ontology of a particular inner worldly being. So ontology, right, under Descartes just becomes an inner affair. Instead of opening up into the world, it is predicated upon the distinction between inner and outer, and thereby creates, as Heidegger has shown, its own problem. And this creates an interesting problem when it comes to things like beauty or usefulness, for example. They become pretty abstract, and they're not connected to a world primarily or primordially, which has a logic, which has its own viviality, right? Something through which we can live, because of course viviality coming from vivos, meaning live or to live. Instead, we sort of, as he says, stamp the world as this detracted, detached, intentionalistic, cogito, intentionalistic, to bring to mind once again Husserlian intentionality. And considering that, for example, Heidegger has laid out that no matter how much you just look at a tool, you're not going to figure out what its handiness is, right? You have to actually use it. You have to make it an object which is ready to hand by acquiring it through your concernful dealings, so to speak. You have to actually engage with the world via Zeug. And by doing so, we figure out that, for example, Descartes just neglects the ways in which beings, by being involved in the world, have ways of being which aren't just reduced to being stamped with a value or having a value cognized for them. The fact that we don't come up with the being of tools, which is to say their handiness, it's already there. Now in section 22 we move into the spatiality of innerworldly things at hand. Innerworldly, once again, situated within a world, and things at hand, this is going to be our Zeug, our useful things which have the being of handiness. And he writes, beings at hand have their various nearnesses which are not ascertained by measuring distances. Their nearness is determined by the handling and use that circumspectively calculate. The structured nearness of useful things means that they do not simply have a place in space, objectively present somewhere, but as useful things are essentially installed, put in their place, set up, and put in order. Useful things have their place, or they lie around, which is fundamentally different from merely occurring in a random spatial position. And for Heidegger, this is what Descartes wasn't able to see. We ascertain a tool's nearness not primarily spatially. This is once again back to that existential spatiality that I've termed to refer to this spatiality which is not primarily ontic, but has to do with Dasein and its world and its way of being absorbed in heedful dealings. Rather, we ascertain the nearness of a tool by the extent to which something is located as handy, by which we are able to ascertain and make it at hand for us. The ability by which it is able to fit into its nook or niche, right? Think about when you're putting up tools in a workshop and you've got them all laid out nice and you can kind of orient them in your shop such that they are in their most suitable location. That suitability is dependent upon, as we've shown in the last lecture, or as Heidegger has shown and I've explicated, the ability for something to be in an equipmental context, in a nexus of relations which is defined by its relationship to Dasein as it interfaces with those tools in those relations. This part is important. This is still on page 100. The actual place is defined as the place of this useful thing for ... in terms of a totality of the interconnected places of the context of useful things at hand in the surrounding world. That's the Umwelt. Place and the multiplicity of places must not be interpreted as the where of a random being present of things. Place is always the definite over there, and the there of a useful thing belonging there. So this is really important, right? Useful things are not just there spatially, even though what Heidegger is trying to show is that, for example, this book, it is in fact here in a definite spatial location. But for me and for my world, Heidegger has been trying to show that such a Zeug, such a tool or a useful thing, does not exist primarily as just spatial coordinates, like on a Cartesian coordinate plane, right? We get the Cartesian coordinate plane from Descartes. And one of the things that Heidegger is trying to point out is that these things exist primarily as situated, or conversely, as, on page 73, as obstinate. So, right, when you look at the books on my shelf, for example, they are situated in this shelf in a way where not only are they physically and spatially there in this location, but they belong there. They're situated in their proper niche, in their nook, quite literally. But if you found my Quran, for example, in the stove, you'd be like, what is this book doing in the stove? Not only is it spatially in a place, but it either belongs to be there or it does not belong to be there. And that belongingness is determined, right, bestimmt, designated, marked by a system of relations, a context of understood practices and norms, and indeed locations for beings such as books, such as pens, such as paintings, whatever it may be. And when I find my Quran in the stove, now it appears as obstinate. Now it appears as something which gets in the way of another dealing. Because, right, I don't just look into the stove to find the book. I look in the stove because I've opened it for some reason. Maybe I'm about to put a dish into the stove. Or maybe I turn the stove on and I open it to check that there's nothing in there because I'm about to start making a dish. So I've already got some concernful, heedful dealings which I'm absorbed in. And all of a sudden, the handiness of the stove has become obstinate through the obstinacy of the book, which has presented itself as obstinate. It is no longer in its niche, and thus, while it is spatially present, it is not primarily spatially present. And in fact, its spatial presence only really hops out, per se, when Zeug become unhandy, as he's mentioned previously. And he stresses that this requires a field of relevant belonging, right? A tool is relevant for a certain task, and as such, that determines its suitability or its usefulness or its handiness in a certain context for a certain task. He says, but a where-to in general, in which the positional totality is referred to a context of useful things, underlies the positional belonging somewhere of a totality of useful things as the condition of their possibility. This where-to of the possible belonging somewhere of useful things, Zeug, which is circumspectively held in view in advance and in heedful dealings, we call the region. Right? So you have a sort of region of affairs, of when I'm concerned with the world, obviously my concern spatially doesn't extend indefinitely. I have a sort of range of things which I am concerned with, which Heidegger here is calling region. And furthermore, when it comes to locating oneself spatially within one's region of circumspection, so to speak, directions themselves have to do with a world which, as Heidegger's been trying to show, is not primarily ontic for us. It is primarily existential. As he says on page 101, the above is what is on the ceiling. The below is what is on the floor. The behind is what is at the door. All these wheres are discovered and circumspectively interpreted on the paths and ways of everyday dealings. They are not ascertained and catalogued by the observational measurement of space. Right? So in my everyday dealings, spatiality is not understood as a complex of spatial coordinates or even a complex of directions. Rather, they are regions that allow us to orient ourselves within them and act within this world of regions which collate together and create literally the entire universe. So when we're absorbed in the world, it is once again founded upon this a priori structure of Weltlichkeit, of worldliness, which allows us to be absorbed with the world via everyday dealings. And he says, in taking care, Dasein, which is in its very being concerned about that being, right? Once again, this is one of the aspects of Dasein, is being is at issue for it, and it makes an issue out of it through its dealings, discovers beforehand the regions which are each in a decisive relevance. The discovery of regions beforehand is determined by the totality of relevance, for which what is at hand is set free as something encountered. And we've ran into this set free before, right? It is literally just to, for example, with Zeug, it is to recognize its handiness and therefore ascertain that handiness by making it at hand, by putting it to use. So the spatiality of the world here is made present through our pre-ontological understanding of the world as something relevant to us. It requires that if we are to have some spatial relation to the world and be able to orient ourselves within this world spatially, it requires that we are able to discover the worldliness of the world. And notably, on page 102, that the world discovers the spatiality of space belonging to it. So note that the world itself seems to have the ability to discover. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means, but I think it has something to do with Heidegger's discussion of logos in the introduction, where it has this ability to reveal, to bring forth something as an object of our understanding, to reveal something in a similar way to how bestimmt works. And indeed, this is what being does, is it determines, bestimmen, beings as beings. It sort of reveals them, marks them, designates them, opens them up as something which we can be concerned about with carefully, which is to say, full of care, not gently, carefully. Now, in section 23, this starts on page 102, once again, of this Stambau updated translation, just to this revised edition, just making sure that we're using the right book for page numbers. This is not the McCory and Robinson translation. In the spatiality of being in the world, we get two things which are de-distancing and directionality. For de-distancing, this is the ability to bring it near. It lets beings be encountered in nearness. He says de-distancing is a circumspect approaching, a bringing near as supplying, preparing, having at hand. This is the ability to orient ourselves towards something useful, which is to say Zeug, or indeed the world revealed in its usefulness, ascertaining its direction in relation to our desires. This is an existential direction. This is not necessarily a spatial direction. This is something's momentum, as it already is in the world. It has something which it's already doing, or some way in which it already is, which we can sort of stumble upon and ascertain and make part of our dealings. And then, right, we can bring Zeug into our purview accordingly. So we can happen upon something which notably already has a being. We don't, as he characterizes it with Descartes, stamp value or usefulness onto it. We bring it near and we let it be encountered in this nearness. We allow it to free itself, to bring it near, to supply it, to prepare it for our use. And he says that for this de-distancing, for example, and this distance that he's talking about, this remoteness is never understood as measurable distance, i.e. this remoteness is not ontic, but existential. So this is once again the existential spatiality of what does this space of this world look like as I'm in it? He says, for example, we say that to go over there is a good walk, a stone's throw, as long as it takes to smoke a pipe. These measures express the fact that they do not intend to measure, but that the estimated remoteness belongs to a being which one approaches in a circumspect, heedful way. And for example, when we talk about durations like half an hour, he says that it's not 30 minutes, but a duration which does not have any length in the sense of a quantitative stretch. This duration is always interpreted in terms of familiar everyday activities. So for things like spatiality of distance and of de-distancing, as well as duration with these common, it's 30 minutes away, it's a hopscotch away, whatever you want to say. This is always subservient to and interpreted on the basis of our circumspect, heedful activities, our tasks, our priorities, indeed, our for the sake of which is to say our, what would you say, our vocation, right? So when we're talking about directions, we only indirectly and obliquely are actually referring to something metric, to, for example, 30 minutes as, relating to the amount of time it takes for the Earth to go around the sun. And we turn this into days and hours and minutes and seconds and so on. We're only referring to that sort of scientific approach obliquely insofar as it is a path by which we are able to orient ourselves and complete our everyday activities. He says that what is at hand in the surrounding world is, after all, not objectively present for an eternal spectator exempt from Dasein, but is encountered in the circumspect, heedful everydayness of Dasein. On these paths, Dasein does not traverse like an objectively present corporeal thing, a stretch of space. It does not eat up kilometers. Nearing and de-distancing are always a heedful being toward what is approached and de-distanced. An objectively long path can be shorter than an objectively much shorter path, which is perhaps an onerous one and strikes one as infinitely long. Right? So this notion of length, of spatiality, actually has a lot to do with, for example, how does Dasein feel about its world? And feel not here in an emotional way, but in the same way in which Heidegger has talked about Sorge so far. He's talked about besorgen, or care, the ability to have the world matter to us in a way that's not emotional necessarily, although it can be. It's just in the sense of, if something changes, it appears to us as something which can present a problem or potentially something useful or helpful. So even this distance of like a path can have to do with, well, how am I feeling, or am I familiar with this path? Such that, for example, I have a little walk I go on every day through my neighborhood. And over time, it feels shorter and shorter, even though the distance remains the same. Because I've sort of de-distanced myself to this path as some sort of, it takes such and such amount of time, it takes such and such amount of effort. Over time, I just become absorbed in that walk and I can start thinking about other things. So Heidegger continues, when there is a prior orientation toward nature and the objectively measured distances of things, one is inclined to consider such interpretations and estimates of remoteness subjective. However, that is a subjectivity which perhaps discovers what is most real about the reality of the world, which has nothing to do with subjective arbitrariness and the subjectivistic conceptions of beings which are in themselves otherwise. Lots of quotations here. The circumspect de-distancing of everyday Dasein discovers the being in itself of the true world of beings with which Dasein, as existing, is always already together. So what he's saying here is that our concernful relation to the world isn't primarily rational or scientific, as Descartes is trying to do with his ontology. Instead, it is guided by interpretation, by our ability to encounter the world as something that matters and within which we can live. And the world, qua encountered by Dasein, is not a deficient, subjective one in the quotation sense, but in the sense of something streamlined and encountered and livable, This is what a world is for Heidegger. He says, what is supposedly nearest is by no means that which has the smallest distance from us. What is near, nächste, lies in that which is in the circle of an average reach, grasp, and look. Right? So once again, this nearness has to do with the ability to which it is sort of within our realm, right? To the extent to which it is within our region of concern. He says that seeing and hearing are senses of distance, not because of their scope, but because Dasein, de-distancing, predominantly lives in them. For someone who, for example, wears spectacles, which are distantially so close to him that they are sitting on his nose, this useful thing is further in being used, further away in the surrounding world than the picture on the wall across the room. This useful thing has so little nearness, Nähe, that it is often not even to be found at all initially. Anyone who wears glasses knows how true this is. I don't notice my glasses until, for example, they present themselves as dusty or dirty or rain falls on them. They become obtrusive in a sense, and they present, or obstinate, I should say, in a sense, to use the correct term here, in such a way where now these glasses present themselves as getting in the way of other activities. And when they do, they become explicitly present for me as an object of concern that I need to do something about. So the spatiality of being in the world is existential relevance. It is the extent to which something is relevant within a spatial region, which is defined, again, not here as ontic spatiality, but as existential spatiality, to the extent to which it presents itself as near or far, such that something which ontically is very, very close, as in the case with spectacles that you wear on your face, you quickly become used to them to the extent to which they become less near than something which is really far away, but that which I'm concerned with. They can be extremely far from me existentially, even while being very close ontically. He says that is also true, for example, of the street, the useful thing for walking. When we walk, we feel it with every step, and it seems to be what is nearest and most real about what is generally at hand. It slides itself, so to speak, along certain parts of our body, the soles of one's feet. And yet, it is more remote than the acquaintance one meets while walking in the distance 20 steps away on the street. Circumspect heedfulness decides about the nearness and farness of what is initially at hand in the surrounding world. Whatever this heedfulness dwells in from the beginning is what is nearest and regulates our de-distancing. So this is the phenomenological perspective that Descartes was completely unable to understand. The phenomenological and existential sense of reality and nearness, of the fact that even though you walk on the street all the time, and in a sense it is more real, what do we even mean by that anymore, than someone who's really far away, insofar as it is closer, it has more to do with supporting your body physically in this particular point, but existentially, it probably supports you very little. It may act as a sort of environment in which you are concerned with the world, but you're not concerned with the road or the street itself. Again, it's only there obliquely. And furthermore, when I bring something close to me, when I bring it close to, like, for example, if there's a book far away on this shelf, and I'm over on the other side of the room and I need to come get the book, I don't bring it close to me insofar as me is seen as a material body. Rather, I bring it close to my world, my heedful dealings. I bring it close to my region of activity. So me is once again only there as a sort of spectator almost, a very active spectator, but nevertheless I am part of my world and my world is part of me, and they are univocally and equiprimordially there at the same time and can't be disentangled. And he says that this de-distancing, the farness from itself of what is at hand, is something that Dasein can never cross over. Dasein is spatial by way of circumspectly discovering space so that it is related to beings, thus spatially encountered by constantly de-distancing. Right? So Dasein never gets beyond the need to continually unfold its world, become familiar with its world. It is constantly faced with new challenges and needs to de-distance new things. Therefore, he states, if Dasein is, it always already has, as directing and de-distancing, its discovered region. So Dasein is already oriented within a world with momentum, with things already going on that it has to make sense of. And to add furthermore to that, orienting yourself directionally within the world, he says on page 106 that left and right are not something subjective from which the subject has a feeling, but they're directions of orientation in a world which is always already at hand. I could never find my way around in a world, and this is a quote from Kant, through a mere feeling of a difference between my two sides. The subject, with the mere feeling of this difference, is a construct posited without regard to the true constitution of the subject, namely that whenever Dasein has this mere feeling, it is always already in a world and must be in order to be able to orient itself at all. He continues, I necessarily orient myself in and from already being in a familiar world. The context of useful things in a world must already be given to Dasein. The fact that I am always already in a world is no less constitutive for the possibility of orientation than the feeling for right or left. Directedness toward the right or the left is grounded in the essential directionality of Dasein in general, which in turn is essentially determined by being in the world. So directionality in a spatial sense is only intelligible upon the grounds of a world to be directed toward. That is what he's trying to say here, is that it is not just enough to have some abstract, oh, this is left, this is right. Left and right only make sense because we are already in a world which we had to come up with the idea of left and right in order to orient ourselves within. And in order to be directed towards anything, it requires already being in something we are trying to direct ourselves throughout. He says, however, Kant is not interested in a thematic interpretation of orientation either. He only wishes to show that all orientation needs a subjective principle. But subjective means here a priori. The a priori of directionality in terms of right and left, I guess it's right and left for you guys, however, is grounded in the subjective a priori of being in the world, which has nothing to do with a determinate character restricted beforehand to a worldless subject. So this is really important. The a priori condition for directedness cannot be an isolated subject, the likes of which we see in Descartes or Kant or Husserl, but rather a world which shows itself as that which Dasein can be directed toward. And by having that ability to direct oneself toward it, you can make sense of the being of these directed signs like right or left. Once again, right or left. And this has to do with being heedfully and circumspectively in discovered inner-worldly space. And once again, inner-worldly space is primarily and primordially existential here. So I think that will suffice for getting us through Chapter 3 of Division 1 of Heidegger's Being in Time. If you have made it this far through reading, congratulations. This was a hard chapter, and I just want you to know that I know it's hard, and at least you made it. Even if you only get pieces here and there, again, feel free to join us for our reading group and talk about it. If not, feel free to leave questions in the comments or whatever you need to do. In the next lecture, we will be completing this reading group or this reading series on Chapter 4, which is going to be talking about Das Man. And that's going to get us into some of the more existentialist stuff with Heidegger, although I know he wasn't too privy to that label. But nevertheless, I hope this has been somewhat helpful. Check out any of the other lectures in this series, as well as those that I do on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and any other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. We can talk about problems, we can go through readings, whatever. I also have a channel, super thanks available if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.